The Unexpected Connection, Part 1. The Photographer's Solitude. Marcus. Chen adjusted his camera lens for the 100th time that evening, staring at the blank wall of his downtown loft.
Oh.
Cameras, arranged by focal length, editing equipment humming softly in the corner, and prints of his best work hanging in precise rows. Everything had its place, just the way he liked it. But tonight, inspiration felt as distant as the city lights twinkling beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows at 28. Marcus had built a successful freelance photography business, capturing corporate events and wedding moments. His technical skills were flawless, his eye for composition sharp, but lately, something felt missing. Every shot looked the same, to him technically perfect, but somehow soulless. He'd been living in this loft for 2 years now, ever since his ex-girlfriend moved out. Taking with her not just her belongings, but also the last traces of spontaneity. In his carefully controlled world, the building was an old converted warehouse in the arts district, filled with creative types who seemed to live with a freedom Marcus both envied and feared. He'd hear music drifting from other apartments, laughter echoing in the hallways, the sounds of people actually living rather than just existing. But Marcus preferred his solitude, or at least he told himself he did. His routine was sacred. Wake at 6, review client emails, spend the day shooting or editing, order takeout, and spend his evenings reviewing photography, theory, or organizing. His equipment, tonight, was different though. He'd finished his latest wedding portfolio early and found himself with nothing to do but think. The silence of his apartment felt heavier than usual, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. He walked to his kitchen, a sleek galley with barely enough space for one person, and made his third cup of coffee of the evening. The routine normally calmed him, but tonight it felt mechanical, empty as he stood at his window, coffee mug warming. His hands, Marcus noticed something he'd never paid attention to before. The apartment directly below his had warm golden light spilling from its windows, and he could see someone moving around inside. Not in a voyeuristic way, but just as part of the urban landscape he'd grown accustomed to observing through his photographer's eye. The person moved with an energy he recognized but couldn't name, purposeful but joyful. Marcus had lived above this neighbor for 2 years, occasionally hearing music or the sound of what might be cooking, but he'd never actually met them. He was terrible with neighbors, always too busy or too tired to do more than nod politely in the hallway. It was easier that way, less complicated, fewer expectations, no risk of disappointment or awkwardness. He settled back at his editing station, trying to lose himself in color correction and cropping, but his mind kept wandering. His latest batch of wedding photos stared back at him from the monitor, beautiful couples in perfect moments, surrounded by family and friends celebrating love. Marcus was skilled at capturing these moments for others, but when was the last time he'd felt that kind of joy himself? When was the last time he'd taken any kind of risk, put himself out there, allowed for the possibility of something unexpected? The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus rarely heard much foot traffic. This late in the evening, especially on weeknights, most of his fellow tenants kept more social hours than he did. The footsteps stopped right outside his door. Marcus found himself holding his breath, wondering if someone was looking for a different apartment. Then came a soft knock. Marcus froze, coffee mug halfway to his lips. Who could possibly be at his door at this hour? His mind raced through possibilities. Emergency? Wrong apartment? Maybe his landlord with some urgent building issue. He wasn't expecting anyone, hadn't ordered food, and couldn't remember the last time someone had visited him socially. The knock came again, softer this time, almost tentative. Marcus set down his mug and walked slowly toward the door, his bare feet silent on the polished concrete floor. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, suddenly aware of how he must look. Rumpled t-shirt, old jeans, hair sticking up from running his fingers through it while he worked. Not that it mattered, since this was probably just a neighbor with a maintenance issue or someone who'd gotten off the elevator on the wrong floor. He opened the door and felt his breath catch in his throat. Standing in the hallway was a woman, about his age, with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and flour dusting her forearms. She wore a simple sundress despite the evening hour, and her eyes held a mixture of nervousness and determination that Marcus found immediately captivating. She was beautiful in an unguarded way that made his photographer's eye itch for his camera. But more than that, she radiated a warmth that seemed to fill the sterile hallway. "Hi," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that suggested this moment was as unexpected for her as it was for him. "I'm Jasmine. I live downstairs." Marcus stared at Jasmine for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. His mind scrambled for the appropriate response while his heart did something entirely unprofessional in his chest. "Marcus," he managed finally. "Hi, I'm Marcus." Jasmine smiled, and the warmth of it seemed to light up the dim hallway. "I know," she said simply. "I've been wanting to meet you properly for months now." "You have?" The question slipped out before Marcus could stop it, sounding more surprised than he intended. He couldn't imagine why anyone would want to meet him. He was hardly the most social person in the building. "I hope this isn't weird," Jasmine continued, shifting slightly from one foot to the other. "But I was baking tonight. I do that when I can't sleep, and I made way too many cinnamon rolls. I was wondering if you might want some." Marcus glanced past her and noticed a plate covered with a checkered kitchen towel in her hands. The sweet, warm scent of cinnamon and sugar suddenly filled his awareness, making his mouth water. When was the last time he'd eaten something homemade? Something that hadn't come from a restaurant or a frozen package? "That's really kind of you," he said, stepping back slightly. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," Jasmine interrupted gently. "Actually, can I be honest with you about something?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. There was something about the way she looked at him, direct and unafraid, that made him feel both seen and terrified. "I've been trying to work up the courage to talk to you for weeks," she admitted. "Every time I see you in the elevator or the lobby, I think about saying something more than just hello, but then I lose my nerve. Tonight I decided I was tired of being a coward." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. This confident, beautiful woman had been nervous about talking to him. It seemed impossible. "You don't seem like the type to be nervous about anything," he said honestly. Jasmine laughed, a sound that was both musical and slightly self-deprecating. "That's where you'd be wrong. I'm terrified most of the time. I just decided a while ago that I was going to do things that scared me anyway." Before Marcus could fully process what was happening, Jasmine stepped closer. "Can I come in for a minute?" she asked. "I promise I'm not a serial killer or anything. I just... I've been wondering about you, and I thought maybe we could talk." Every rational part of Marcus's brain was telling him to politely decline. He didn't know this woman. People didn't just show up at your door at 10 o'clock at night with baked goods and requests to come inside. This wasn't how his carefully ordered world worked. But something in Jasmine's eyes made him step back and open the door wider. "Okay," he heard himself say. "Sure." Jasmine's face lit up with genuine delight, and she stepped into his apartment. With the kind of confident grace that suggested she'd never doubted he would say yes, Marcus closed the door behind her and turned to find her taking in his space with obvious curiosity. "Wow," she said, walking slowly toward his photography equipment. "This is amazing. You're a photographer?" Freelance, Marcus confirmed suddenly, self-conscious about the pristine organization of everything. Mostly weddings and corporate events. Jasmine set the plate of cinnamon rolls on his kitchen counter and moved to examine the prints on his walls. Marcus watched her face as she studied his work, looking for some reaction he could read. Her expression was thoughtful, concentrated, like she was really seeing what he'd tried to capture. "These are beautiful," she said finally, stopping in front of a black and white portrait he'd taken at a wedding last spring. "You have an incredible eye for emotion." Marcus felt his cheeks warm with pleasure. Most people looked at his work and commented on the technical aspects, the lighting, the composition, the clarity. No one ever talked about emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly. Jasmine turned back to him, and something in her expression had changed. She looked more serious now, almost vulnerable. "Can I ask you something personal?" Marcus nodded, not sure what he was agreeing to, but unable to say no to whatever she wanted to know. Are you happy? She asked simply. The question caught Marcus completely off guard. Happy? When was the last time he'd even thought about happiness as something to pursue rather than something that happened to other people? He looked around his perfectly organized apartment, at his expensive equipment and his successful career, and realized he had no idea how to answer her question. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't think I've thought about it in a long time. Jasmine stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the vanilla and cinnamon that seemed to cling to her skin. I think about it all the time, she said softly. And I've been watching you, not in a creepy way, she added quickly, but we're neighbors, and I see you sometimes. You always look so serious, so focused on something far away. I started wondering if anyone ever just makes you laugh. Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd been keeping carefully locked away. I don't laugh much, he admitted. That's what I thought, Jasmine said, reaching up to touch his face with flour-dusted fingers. And that's a shame, because you have a beautiful smile. I've seen it a few times when you help Mrs. Patterson with her groceries. Marcus couldn't breathe. This woman, this stranger who somehow wasn't a stranger at all, was touching his face like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her skin was warm and soft, and he found himself leaning into her touch without thinking about it. Jasmine, he whispered, not sure what he was trying to say. I know this is crazy, she said, her thumb tracing along his cheekbone. I know we barely know each other, but sometimes you just feel something, you know. Sometimes you meet someone, and you just... No. Marcus did know. Against all logic and reason, he knew exactly what she meant. The next morning, Marcus found himself sitting in the small coffee shop on the ground floor of their building, staring at his reflection in his untouched latte. He'd barely slept after Jasmine left his apartment the night before, their conversation, replaying in his mind on an endless loop. She'd stayed for 2 hours, and they'd talked about everything and nothing: her work as a pastry chef at a downtown bakery, struggles with creative fulfillment, their shared observations about their eccentric neighbors. But it was the way she'd looked at him that kept him awake. Like she saw something in him that he'd forgotten was there. You look like someone who's had a revelation, came a familiar voice from beside him. Marcus looked up to see Derek Washington, the owner of the used bookstore next door, settling into the chair across from him with his own coffee. Derek was one of those people who seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. The kind of man who remembered your name after meeting you once and always had time for conversation. Something like that, Marcus replied, not sure how much he wanted. To share, Derek was in his early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of easy manner that made people want to confide in him. Marcus had bought books from him occasionally, usually photography collections or technical manuals, and Derek always seemed genuinely interested in discussing the artistic elements rather than just making a sale. Want to talk about it? Asked, settling back in his chair. I've got nowhere to be for the next hour, and you look like you could use a friendly ear. Marcus found himself nodding before he could think better of it. There was something about Derek's presence that invited honesty. Have you ever had someone completely surprise you? It's like show up in your life when you weren't expecting it and just change everything. Derek's expression grew thoughtful. I mean, like when my wife walked into my bookstore 3 years ago looking for a cookbook and ended up staying to help me reorganize my entire fiction section. Exactly like that, Marcus said, feeling a spark of recognition. Except I don't know what to do with it. Ah, Derek said, taking a sip of his coffee. So this is about Jasmine. Marcus nearly choked on his latte. How did you? She was in. Here about 20 minutes ago, looking just as confused as you do right now, Derek explained with a gentle smile. Plus, she mentioned she'd finally worked up the courage to talk to the photographer upstairs. This neighborhood's smaller than you think. Marcus felt his face flush. What did she say? That she'd done something impulsive and wasn't sure if? It was the best or worst decision she'd ever made, Derek replied. Sound familiar? Marcus nodded miserably. I don't do impulsive. I plan everything. I research everything. I don't just ... feel things and act on them. And how's that been working for you? Derek asked, but not unkenned. Marcus thought about. his perfectly organized apartment, his successful but unfulfilling career. The months of creative block that had been plaguing him. Not great, actually. Jasmine's a good person, Derek said after a moment. She's been coming to my store for about a year now, always looking for cookbooks or novels about people who take big risks. She tips the baristas here more than her coffee costs, and she brought my wife's homemade soup when she had the flu last month. But she's also been hurt before. Marcus looked up sharply. What do you mean? Her last relationship ended badly, Derek explained. Guy strung her along for 2 years, never wanted to commit to anything, never made an effort, left her feeling like maybe she was too much for people, too intense, too willing to put herself out there. Marcus felt a stab of something that might have been anger. How could anyone make Jasmine feel like she was too much of anything? The thing is, Derek continued, I think she sees something in you that she hasn't seen in a long time. Someone genuine. Someone who might actually appreciate what she has to offer instead of being intimidated by it. But what if I mess it up? Marcus asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him all morning. What if I'm not enough for someone like her? Derek leaned forward slightly. Can I tell you something? When my wife first walked into my store, I was convinced she was way out of my league. She was funny and smart and beautiful, and I was just some guy who spent his days surrounded by dusty books. I almost let her walk away because I was so sure I'd disappoint her. What changed her mind? She did, Derek said simply. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. More importantly, she was willing to take a risk on it.
Oh.
Question is, are you willing to take a risk on what she sees in you? Marcus stared out the coffee shop window, watching people hurry past on their way to work. Everyone seemed so certain of where they were going, so confident in their direction. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of certainty about anything? She touched my face, Marcus said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop. Them. Derek's eyebrows rose slightly. And it felt like waking up from a really long sleep, Marcus admitted. Like suddenly I could see colors I'd forgotten existed. Like that sounds like something worth exploring, Derek said gently. Marcus nodded slowly, feeling something settle in his chest. Maybe Derek was right. Maybe it was time to stop planning and analyzing and just ... see what happened. She said she'd been watching me, Marcus continued. Not in a creepy way, but just noticing things. No one's ever paid attention to me like that before. And how does that make you feel? Marcus considered the question seriously. Terrified, he said finally. And also hopeful. Like maybe I'm not as invisible as I thought I was. Derek smiled. You're definitely not invisible, my friend. You just needed someone to help you see that. As if summoned by their conversation. The coffee shop door chimed, and Jasmine walked in. She looked around uncertainly until her eyes landed on Marcus. For a moment, neither of them moved, and Marcus felt that same electric awareness he'd experienced the night before. Derek cleared, his throat softly. I think that's my cue to get back to the store, he said, standing and gathering his things. He paused beside Marcus's chair and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the scariest things. Don't let fear make your decisions for you. And with that, Derek nodded politely to Jasmine as he passed her, leaving Marcus alone with the woman who had turned his world upside down in the space of a single evening. Jasmine approached his table slowly, her hands wrapped around a to-go cup like it was an anchor. Hi, she said softly. Hi, Marcus replied, standing automatically. Would you like to sit? She nodded and settled into the chair Derek had vacated. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the previous night hanging between them. Sorry if I was too forward last night, Jasmine said finally. I have a tendency to jump in with both feet without thinking about whether the other person is ready to swim. Marcus shook his head quickly. You weren't too forward. You were. He struggled for the right word. You were exactly what I needed, even though I didn't know I needed it. Jasmine's face brightened slightly. Really? Really? Marcus confirmed, feeling more certain with each word. I've been thinking about what you said, about happiness, about taking risks. I think I've been so busy trying to control everything that I forgot to actually live. And what are you going to do about that? Jasmine asked, leaning forward slightly. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling like he was about to jump off a cliff. I was hoping you might teach me. 3 days later, Marcus found himself in Chloe Kim's art studio across town, surrounded by canvases splashed with vibrant colors and sculptures that seemed to defy gravity. Chloe had been his childhood friend, the one person who'd known him. Before he'd built all his careful walls and organized systems, she was also the one person who could call him on his nonsense without him getting defensive about it. So let me get this straight, Chloe said, not looking up from the painting she was working on. A beautiful woman shows up at your door with homemade cinnamon rolls, tells you she's been thinking about you for months, spends 2 hours in your apartment having the kind of conversation you normally only dream about, and you're here asking me whether you should pursue it? Marcus shifted uncomfortably on the paint-splattered stool she'd provided. When you put it like that, it sounds obvious. It is obvious, Marcus, Chloe said, finally turning to face him. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had a streak of blue paint across her left cheek. At 25, she was 3 years younger than Marcus, but she'd always seemed older, wiser, more connected to some essential truth about living that he'd never quite grasped. But what if Marcus began? No, Chloe interrupted, pointing her paintbrush at him like a weapon. No what-ifs. You've been what-ifing yourself out of every good thing that's ever tried to happen to you. Remember Jenny from college? Marcus winced. Jenny had been a girl in his photography class who'd clearly been interested in him. They'd spent hours together in the dark room, talking about art and life and dreams. She'd invited him to parties, asked him to study sessions that were obviously dates, even kissed him once after a particularly late night of developing prints. But Marcus had convinced himself he was misreading the signals that someone like her couldn't possibly be interested. In someone like him? Jenny was different, Marcus protested weakly. Jenny was exactly the same, Chloe countered. A wonderful woman who saw something in you that you couldn't see in yourself. And instead of trusting her judgment, you decided you knew better. You convinced yourself it couldn't be real, and you pushed her away. Marcus had to admit she had a point. He'd never actually asked Jenny how she felt, or given her the chance to make her own decision about whether he was worth taking a risk on. He'd just assumed he wasn't, and acted accordingly. This is different, though, Marcus said, trying to articulate the feeling that had been growing in his chest since that first night with Jasmine. With Jenny, I was scared. And with Jasmine, I'm still scared, but I'm more scared of not finding out what could happen. Chloe's expression softened. Now that's more like it. Tell me about her. Marcus found himself smiling without meaning to. She's a pastry chef. She lives in the apartment below mine, and apparently she's been noticing me for months. She says things that surprise me, like she sees parts of me I didn't know existed, such as, she said. I have a beautiful smile, Marcus said, feeling his cheeks warm. No one's ever said that before. And she talked about how I help our elderly neighbor with groceries. Like it was something special instead of just basic human decency. Maybe because most people don't do basic human decency anymore, Chloe suggested. Maybe she's been watching you be kind and thoughtful and genuine in a world full of people who are too busy or too self-absorbed to notice when someone needs help. Marcus considered this. He'd never thought of his small gestures as anything remarkable, but Jasmine had made them sound like evidence of character rather than simple politeness. She touches me like she's not afraid of me, he continued, the words tumbling out now that he'd started. Like she trusts me completely, even though we barely know each other. When she looks at me, I feel like maybe I'm not as boring as I thought I was. Chloe set down her paintbrush and gave him her full attention. Marcus, do you hear yourself right now? What do you mean? Glowing, she said simply. I haven't seen you look this alive in years. Maybe ever. Marcus touched his face self-consciously. I don't glow. You do, Chloe insisted. You're practically vibrating with possibility. This woman has done something to you in 3 days that I've been trying to do for 20 years, which is made you believe you're worth taking a risk on. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they were so completely devastatingly true. For most of his adult life, he'd operated from the assumption that he wasn't quite enough, not interesting enough, Not exciting enough. Not worth the effort it would take someone to really know him. He'd built his entire life around being self-sufficient because he'd never believed anyone would want to share the load. I don't want to hurt her, Marcus said quietly. She's been hurt before. Derek told me about her ex, how he strung her along. Without ever really committing, what if I can't be what she needs? What if I'm too set in my ways, too cautious, too... Ash! Too afraid to let someone love you. Chloe finished gently. Marcus nodded miserably. Chloe walked over and sat down beside him, her paint-stained hands folding over his. Marcus, I've known you since we were kids. I've watched you be loyal and kind and thoughtful and incredibly talented. I've also watched you hide all of those things behind this idea that you're somehow not enough for the good things in life. Squeezed his hands. But here's the thing about love, it's not about being enough. It's about being willing. It's about showing up and being honest and letting someone see who you really are, even when it's terrifying. What if who I really am disappoints her? What if who you really are is exactly what she's been looking for? Chloe countered. What if all those things you think make you boring, your thoughtfulness, your loyalty, your willingness to help? People, what if those are exactly the things that make you extraordinary? Marcus felt something shift inside him, like a door he'd been keeping locked, suddenly swinging open. You really think so? I know so, Chloe said firmly. And more importantly, she seems to know it too. The question is, are you going to trust her judgment? Or are you going to decide you know better than she does about what she wants? Marcus thought about Jasmine's face when she'd touched him, the certainty in her voice when she'd said she'd been thinking about him. The way she'd looked at his photographs like she could see the soul he'd put into them. She asked me to teach her about photography, he said suddenly, remembering their conversation in the coffee shop. She wants to learn how to see the way I see. And what did you say? Marcus replied, feeling a surge of something that might have been excitement. We're supposed to meet tomorrow afternoon. Chloe grinned. Now that's the Marcus I remember. The one who used to climb trees just to see what the world looked like from up there. Marcus laughed, a sound that surprised him with its lightness. I haven't thought about that in years. Maybe it's time to start climbing again, Chloe suggested. Maybe it's time to see what the world looks like when you're brave enough to get a little higher. As Marcus left Chloe's studio that evening, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for tomorrow. Not the careful, controlled anticipation of a planned shoot or a scheduled meeting, but the wild, uncertain excitement of not knowing what might happen next. For the first time in his adult life, that uncertainty felt like a gift rather than a threat. The afternoon light filtering through the windows of Marcus's apartment was perfect for photography, soft and golden. The kind of light that made everything look like it belonged in a magazine. But Marcus wasn't thinking about technical perfection, as he watched Jasmine examine his camera equipment with the same focused attention she'd given his photographs that first night. So the aperture controls how much light gets in, she asked, turning one of his lenses over in her hands. Partially, Marcus said, moving to stand beside her. But it also controls depth of field, how much of your image is in focus versus how much is blurred. He was close enough to smell her perfume again, that light floral scent that had been haunting his dreams for the past week. Close enough to see the way she bit her lower lip slightly when she was concentrating. It was their third photography lesson, and Marcus was beginning to suspect that Jasmine was more interested in spending time with him than actually learning about cameras. Not that he minded. Show me, Jasmine, said, holding the camera out too. Him, instead of taking it from her, Marcus moved behind her, his hands covering hers on the camera body. He felt her intake of breath, the way she leaned back slightly, so her shoulders touched his chest. If you open the aperture wide, here. Turn this ring, you. Get a shallow depth of field, he said, his voice coming out quieter than he'd intended. See how the background gets soft and dreamy? It makes your subject stand out. And if you close it down? Jasmine asked, but she wasn't looking through the viewfinder anymore. She was looking at him. Everything stays sharp, Marcus replied, though he was having trouble concentrating on photography theory with her this close. Nothing gets lost in the blur. Which do you prefer? She asked, turning in his arms so they were facing each other. Marcus considered the question seriously, both the technical one and the metaphorical one he suspected she was really asking. It depends on what you're trying to capture, he said finally. Sometimes you want everything crystal clear, every detail preserved. But sometimes the most beautiful images come from letting some things go soft around the edges, focusing on what really matters. Jasmine smiled, and Marcus felt that familiar flutter in his chest. I think I like the soft edges approach, she said. Yeah? Marcus asked, his hand still covering hers on the camera. Yeah, she confirmed, leaning closer. I think sharp focus on everything at once can be overwhelming. Better to concentrate on what's important and let the rest take care of itself. Marcus looked down at her, at this woman who had somehow walked into his life and made everything feel possible again. The golden afternoon light caught the highlights in her hair. He found himself thinking like a photographer, about composition and timing and the decisive moment when everything aligned perfectly. Jasmine, he said softly. Marcus, she replied, and there was a question in her voice. Instead of answering with words, Marcus lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was still asking permission. But when Jasmine's arms came up around his neck, and she kissed him back with an enthusiasm that made his knees weak, all his careful restraint dissolved. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. I need to tell you something, he said. What? Jasmine whispered. I haven't felt this way about anyone in maybe ever, Marcus admitted. You scare me completely, but in the best possible way. Jasmine's face lit up with joy. Good, she said. Because I've been falling for you since that first night. And I was starting to worry you were going to be too polite to do anything about it. Marcus laughed, the sound coming easier now than it had in years. I'm done being polite, he said. I'm done being careful. I want to see what happens when I stop planning everything and just ... live. What do you want to do first, Jasmine asked. Marcus thought about it seriously. 3 weeks ago, his answer would have been to research options, make lists, carefully consider all possible outcomes. But now, with Jasmine in his arms and possibilities stretching out before them like an uncharted landscape, he wanted something entirely different. I want to take you somewhere we've never been, he said. Somewhere neither of us has ever been before. And I want to take pictures of you in natural light, laughing at something I've said. That's oddly specific, Jasmine said with a grin. I've been thinking about it, Marcus admitted. About capturing joy instead of just recording events. About finding beauty in spontaneous moments instead of posed perfection. And you think I can help you with that? Jasmine asked. I think you already have, Marcus replied. You've helped me remember that the most beautiful things in life are usually the ones we don't plan for. 6 months later, Derek was arranging a new display in the front window of his bookstore when he noticed Marcus and Jasmine walking down the street together. Camera equipment slung over Marcus's shoulder and Jasmine's hand firmly clasped in his. They were laughing about something, their heads bent close together, and Derek couldn't help but smile at the transformation in both of them. Marcus looked lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying a weight he'd finally learned to set down. And Jasmine had a glow about her that suggested she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for. They stopped in front of Derek's window. Marcus raised his camera to capture Jasmine's reflection in the glass. Her image multiplied and layered like something from a dream. Through the window, Derek could see the title of the book display. Behind them, love stories. When two people choose each other. It seemed fitting, he thought. Some of the best love stories were about people who learned to choose each other not despite their differences, but because of them. People who discovered that the scariest risks often led to the most beautiful destinations. As Marcus and Jasmine disappeared around the corner, probably heading toward another one of their photography adventures, Derek turned back to his books with a satisfied smile. Sometimes the universe really did put people exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. He just hoped they were brave enough to notice. The afternoon light streaming through his shop windows was perfect for reading. Soft and golden, the kind of light that made everything look like it belonged in a story worth telling. Derek settled behind his counter with his own book and a cup of coffee, content in the knowledge that some stories had endings that were really just beginnings in disguise. Outside, the city hummed with the quiet energy of people learning to be brave, learning to take chances, learning that sometimes Most extraordinary things happened when you stopped planning long enough to let them surprise you. And in a loft apartment across town, two cameras sat side by side on a desk. Surrounded by photographs of moments neither Marcus nor Jasmine had seen coming, images of laughter and discovery, hands touching in golden light of two people, learning that love was less about finding someone perfect and more about finding someone willing to be imperfect together. The best photographs, they'd learned, weren't about technical perfection. They were about capturing the moment when two people stopped being afraid and started being alive.